Hello, everyone. This is the May presentation of the Friends of History First Wednesday Lecture Series. I am Ben Woodbury with the Friends of History, and will be your host today. Let me start with a few administrative details before today's presentation. As a reminder, all recent, past, and future First Wednesday online lectures are now, or will be, available on our new Friends of History webpage, which is provided below. Just click on the lecture series link at the top of the homepage. Information on the webpage is also available regarding the walking tours of the historic downtown Santa Fe, a major initiative of the Friends of History. Take a look. Hello, everyone. We're starting the May presentation with the Friends of History First Wednesday lecture. Our monthly lectures are being provided free of charge by the Friends of History with the support of the New Mexico History Museum. We do, however, accept and encourage donations. These will go directly to support the lecture series and, more importantly, all History Museum programs and exhibits. Should you wish to make a donation, just go to our new website and click on the Donate Now button at the top of the page. Before introducing today's speaker, I want you to know that for our next lecture, we are fortunate to have as our guest Rick Hendricks, presently the New Mexico State Administrator, and in the recent past, the New Mexico State Historian. He will speak on Pueblo Indian sovereignty. If you wish to be on our mailing list to learn more about this lecture and all upcoming lectures, you can sign on our webpage or email us at the address cited below. Now for today's lecture. Our speaker is Ms. Leah F. Tukey, the Curator of History at the New Mexico Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum in Las Cruces, New Mexico. She earned a master's degree in agricultural history and rural studies from Iowa State University. Her work at the New Mexico Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum involves research and writing for exhibits, maintaining the museum's library and archives, and too many other jobs to mention. Last year, Leah curated the museum's exhibit, Home on the Range, From Ranches to Rockets, from which this lecture is drawn. Following her presentation, we will have a live question and answer session with Leah. Your questions and comments can be posted at any time on the YouTube chat room during and after the presentation. Upon completion of today's event, both the lecture and the Q&A session will be posted on the Friends of History webpage, as well as on the History Museum's YouTube and Facebook pages. So now we welcome Ms. Tukey.
Ben, thank you so much for the introduction. It is such a pleasure to be here, and thank you to the Friends of the History Museum for the invitation to speak today. My presentation today is based on an exhibit that we installed at the New Mexico Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum in the fall of 2019. The exhibit was intended to be up through 2020, which was the 75th anniversary of the creation of White Sands Missile Range. We were looking forward to being part of the range's celebration, but of course, COVID-19 had different ideas. We now plan to keep the exhibit up until June of 2022. I want to share just a little history of the exhibit and where the idea came from before I get into my story. This image is not photoshopped. It is an actual photo taken by Judson Carruthers, an official White Sands Missile Range photographer for 35 years, from the 1950s into the late 1980s. The rocket you see is a Redstone. The Redstone was a direct descendant of the German V-2 rocket, developed by a team of predominantly German rocket engineers under the leadership of Wernher von Braun. Von Braun had been brought to the United States after World War II as part of Operation Paperclip. The Mercury rocket that was used on the 5th of May, 1961, to launch Alan Shepard on his suborbital flight to become the second person and the first American in space, was a derivation of the redstone. Now, you may be asking, why would a farm and ranch museum have an exhibit on rockets? And that would be a legitimate question. Well, this is how it happened. Several years ago, I was the director of education at the New Mexico Space Museum in Alamogordo. And while I was there, I learned all about the missile range and what it goes on out there. Because of my background in agricultural history, I was very interested in learning more about the ranchers who lived on the range before the military arrived and took over during World War II. Back then, I thought it would make an interesting exhibit. But since it was a space museum, the ranching angle didn't seem to fit. Years went by, and I meanwhile got a job as a history curator at the Farm and Ranch Museum in Las Cruces. One day, someone dropped off a large envelope full of pictures. And when I opened it, this photo blew me away. I thought, here is the opening photo for the Ranching at White Sands exhibit that I'd been thinking about for more than 10 years. I first decided to just focus on the ranching story, but was later convinced that we should also tell the story of the rockets and the missile range, and the rest, as they say, is history. I'm going to start this conversation as the exhibit starts with life at White Sands and the surrounding areas before World War II. In the early 1900s, much of the arid land east of Las Cruces, including the San Andreas and Oscura Mountains and the Tularosa Basin, was ranching country. Many of these ranchers came from Texas in the late 1800s and found grass tall and plentiful. They soon realized that they had arrived during a particularly wet climate period and that raising cattle would not be as profitable as they had once believed. But they stayed on. By 1940, the typical ranch in the area was composed of small pieces of privately owned land, supplemented by large parcels of federal and state land, which the ranchers leased for grazing purposes. Life on the range was filled with opportunities, challenges, hardships, and rewards. In 1942, the lives of these hardy ranchers dramatically changed. So what did it take to be a rancher in southern New Mexico? Well, to be a successful rancher, you had to be self-sufficient. No matter where your land was, it was a long way from town and a hard road to get there. A rancher needed to be able to repair windmills, build fence, cut lumber, dig water wells, and create water distribution systems. Blacksmithing and mechanical skills were necessary in order to keep the equipment in good working order. Ranchers also needed to protect their livestock from wild animals that lived in the harsh deserts and mountain landscapes. A rancher had to be handy with a gun and able to set a trap to catch predators common to the area, like black bear, wildcat, wolf, and coyote. There is literally a sea of water under the Tularosa Basin, but because it is heavily laden with minerals and usually measures out to be saltier than ocean water, the ranchers who lived in the flats of the basin could not use the water they pumped from the ground. By the time local ranchers realized there was not enough surface water to maintain grass for their cattle, and in many cases for their livestock, it was too late. They had settled in, brought family members west, built homes, and made homesteads. The most common tactic of obtaining water for those who lived in the mountains and at higher elevations was to hand dig or drill wells, and to use windmills to pump the water out of the ground. Some ranchers were lucky enough to have natural springs that fed the ranch and made it possible to raise cattle. Many ranchers dug and lined pools at the water source to collect as much water as possible for their animals to drink. Most families on the range raised cattle or goats. Ranchers who owned land on the flats and who had reliable sources of water could raise cattle. However, the carrying capacity could be as low as 7 or 8 head per section, and a section is about 640 acres. The ranchers who lived in the mountains surrounding the Tularosa Basin were more likely to raise goats that ate less than cows and were more suited to the rough terrain. While at the end of the 19th century, many ranchers had been raising sheep, by the 1930s, much of the grasses had disappeared from the landscape and goats were better able to survive on prolific shrubs. Two big challenges faced ranchers when it came to feeding their families. It was a long way to town to purchase groceries, and there was no practical way to refrigerate food. Ranch families dealt with both of these problems by purchasing large quantities of dry and canned goods. Many families planted orchards and grew their own fruit. They also had gardens and canned the produce that they raised. Meat was easy to come by, but it was nearly impossible to store large amounts of slaughtered beef or even the meat from a goat or a sheep. Many ranchers would share meat with their neighbors or family members. While refrigeration was difficult, there were some creative methods for preserving fresh food, items like milk, eggs, and meat. Most ranchers had cisterns for collecting and holding water, and because they were dug into the ground, they were cool, and you could hang a basket inside to hold items and keep them cool. You could also wrap up a slab of meat in waxed paper and burlap before wrapping it in an old quilt to be kept in the coolest part of the house. By the late 1930s, some ranchers were able to buy gas-powered refrigerators that burned propane instead of using electricity. Distance from the closest community with the doctor was a problem for ranch families when it came to injury and illness. Accidents, snake bites, pregnancy and childbirth, and diseases of old age were very common. But because ranch folks didn't get to town very often, catching communicable diseases like colds and flu were less likely. Most women made arrangements to go to town to deliver their babies, but on occasion, a surprise early birth happened, and when it did, the family had to pitch in and get the job done without a doctor or a midwife present. Verena Andrig Mahoney remembers, "We had sore throats and stuff like that, but we gargled kerosene. Or Daddy would make cough drops with sugar and kerosene. Put a little kerosene on the sugar and then burn it. Just strike a match on it. Light it up. It's hard like cough drops." Like much of life on the range, entertainment was homemade. Saturday night would find ranch families gathered together with neighbors to enjoy a card game or a dance. It was common for people to have dances at the local schoolhouses, but the most popular place was the dance floor at the Leland Miller Ranch. Miller built the portable dance floor with numbered boards that could be taken apart and put back together whenever he wanted. Just throw a little sawdust on top and away you go. Ranchers brought their own instruments and provided music. A potluck meal was also standard. The dances would go on into the early morning hours, but there was often enough energy left over to participate in a ranch rodeo the next day. Ranch children, like all children, created their own entertainment. When they weren't busy tending to livestock, working in the garden, or doing schoolwork, ranch kids enjoyed riding horses, outdoor games. The large holding tank at the Lucero Ranch was a popular place to swim, and some kids remember ice skating on the water tank during a particularly cold winter. Children's education was another challenge that ranchers faced head-on. There were several different options. Some youngsters went to school in small communities like Cutter and Ingle on the west side of the range, Bingham on the north, or Oscura and Bryce on the east. In order to get to these schools, they rode a horse, walked, or were delivered by car or bus. And there's a photo of a school bus from the area. Other families could afford to keep a second home in larger towns like Alamogordo, Tularosa, Las Cruces, or Socorro. with children attending the local schools. Other children enrolled in boarding schools like the Loreto Academy in Las Cruces. Some families built their own neighborhood schools like the one at Bear Den Canyon that was just a few miles from the Henderson and Wood ranches. The Cox family at the San Augustine Ranch hired a tutor and had a classroom in their home. Ranch houses came in all shapes and sizes and were made from a wide variety of materials. As one might expect in New Mexico, many houses were built of adobe bricks. It was a building material that you could make yourself on site. Normally, the adobe bricks were covered with stucco to protect them from the erosion by wind and occasional rain. Another abundant building material, especially in the mountains, was stone. Mortar or mud was used to fill and seal the gaps between the stones and bind them together. Due to the absence of large trees in the area, there were very few log cabins. The other building style used by ranchers was wood framing, usually covered with board and batten. Because board and batten are not airtight, the families who lived in these homes covered the interior walls with layers of linoleum, cardboard, or newspapers. As I said earlier, life for the ranchers and their families on the range was filled with opportunities, challenges, hardships, and rewards. But in 1941, an event that took place thousands of miles away brought ranch life as they knew it to an end. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. This is a famous declaration given by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt on the day after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and it announces the event that would change the lives of the ranchers at White Sands forever. In early 1941, with war raging in Europe, U.S. officials looked at the Tularosa Basin as a possible training site and bombing range for Britain's Royal Air Force. The bombing of Pearl Harbor changed these plans, and on January 20th, 1942, an executive order establishing a training range for U.S. crews at the Tularosa Basin. Called the Alamogordo Bombing Range, it was just one of dozens scattered across the Southwest. New Mexico alone hosted 13 bombing and gunnery ranges and 8 air bases during the war. Army Corps of Engineer representatives visited to survey the ranches and tell the owners that they had to move out. They carried lease agreements stating that the land would be needed until the end of the war, and owners would receive annual payments based on the size of their ranch units. Ranchers were told they needed to remove their livestock, as they would not be allowed back to their lands until the end of the war. Ranch families performed their patriotic duties and complied with the orders. Some were only given a few weeks to leave. Because the United States was not well prepared for the war, the Army wanted ranchers out as soon as possible, so the training of the millions of men needed for the conflict could begin. Unfortunately, their methods of removal were often rushed and harsh. To this day, many of the families affected portray Army management as heartless and cruel. Many of the families had spent decades living and working these ranches through good times and bad. They were proud and self-reliant. None were rich, so they had very few resources for moving thousands of goats and cattle and no place to move them. The Army didn't provide any financial assistance for the moves and didn't make any lease payments until after the first year. With so many animals suddenly for sale, there was a glut on the market, and ranchers were forced to sell their livestock at rock-bottom prices. The forced relocation and future actions of the military left them angry and led to years of resentment. With the war and all its anguish, there was no reason for the ranchers to be treated in the rude and dictatorial manner by these employees of the government, remembers Alice Lee Cox. My story now moves from life on ranches to life on the missile range. And where do we start this story? Well, I think we have to start with the proverbial elephant in the room. In 1942, in response to reports from European scientists that the Germans might be building an atomic bomb, President Roosevelt authorized the formation of the Manhattan Project. The atomic age began on July 16, 1945, at Trinity Site. Trinity Site is one of the most historically significant places on the planet. It plays a role in our story because ranches belonging to brothers George, Dave, and Ross McDonald were used for the test site, base camp, and ground zero. Scientists at Los Alamos, New Mexico, the scientific center for building the atomic bomb, came up with two bomb designs. One used uranium-235 and was relatively simple. It was used to destroy Hiroshima, Japan on August 6, 1945. The second design used 13.5 pounds of plutonium at its core and was more efficient and sophisticated. It was tested at Trinity Site and was dropped on Nagasaki, Japan on August 9, 1945. The question many people ask is, why did the government choose White Sands to test the atomic bomb? In fact, many people think that White Sands Missile Range was started as a site to test the bomb, but this is not true. For the testing of the plutonium bomb, security and secrecy were of utmost importance. Los Alamos scientists looked at 8 different sites and chose the secluded desert of southern New Mexico at the north end of the remote Alamogordo bombing range. In the fall of 1944, soldiers started arriving at Trinity Site, an 18 by 24 mile area, to prepare for the test. Base camp, where the soldiers lived, was located at the Dave and Ross McDonald Ranch. The George McDonald Ranch house was used as an assembly site for the bomb's plutonium core. Ground zero, just 2 miles away, was where the bomb was detonated atop a 100-foot steel tower. Although no information on the test was released until after the atomic bomb was used against Japan, people in New Mexico knew that something had happened. The shock broke windows 120 miles away. Army officials simply stated that the munitions storage area had accidentally exploded at the Alamogordo bombing range. So that's a very brief discussion about the elephant in the room. Now let's talk for a minute about the first rocket that was tested at White Sands. The first rocket launched at White Sands Proving Ground was the WAC Corporal. WAC stands for Without Attitude Control. The Jet Propulsion Laboratory at Caltech received orders in 1945 to build a rocket capable of carrying a 25-pound package of meteorology instruments to an altitude of 100,000 feet. They built the WAC Corporal and sent it to White Sands to be tested. The rocket was 12 inches in diameter and 16 feet long. It burned acid and aniline and generated about 1,500 pounds of thrust. To make the WAC as light as possible, JPL used only 3 fins instead of 4 and welded the outside skin to the internal components. This meant that it didn't need weighty internal bracing. Even with these modifications, the rocket was underpowered. So engineers added the tiny TIM rocket motor as a booster. This motor burned less than a second and produced 50,000 pounds of thrust. With the booster, the WAC Corporal reached an altitude of 227,040 feet. Now we've talked a little bit about the first rocket tested at White Sands Missile Range. Let's talk about the most important one, at least the most important rocket in the early years of the range. The German Vengeance weapon. The German V-2 rocket was the first man-made object to go into space. It was designed in Nazi Germany and assembled underground by concentration camp prisoners. The first successful flight was on October 3rd, 1942, when the missile reached an altitude of 60 miles and landed about 120 miles downrange. The V-2s were 46 feet tall and 5.5 feet in diameter. At launch, they weighed about 27,000 pounds, with 19,000 pounds of propellant and a 2,000-pound warhead. The missile had a range of about 200 miles and fell on its target at 3,500 miles per hour, just 5 miles after launch. Though more than 3,000 V-2s were launched in Europe during World War II, more people were killed building the rockets than died at target sites. The missile did not significantly affect the war effort and was considered a failure as a weapon. However, it marked a breakthrough in technology that led to the space race. A little about V-2 mechanics. Two 1,200-gallon propellant tanks took up most of the space in the V-2. And when asked why the Germans used alcohol for fuel, Konrad Dannenberg, a propulsion expert for von Braun, said, "Since Germany had no oil wells, the fuel for the V-2 had to be alcohol." He went on to explain that the German government asked booze makers to distill as much ethyl alcohol from potatoes as possible for use for rocket fuel. The V-2 had large fins on the tail section to provide stability and a nose cone where the warhead was normally located. The warhead was composed of TNT and ammonium nitrate. At White Sands, the nose cone was used to house various instruments and experiments. The control compartment housed gyroscopes and other devices used to guide the rocket to its target. It also held timing devices to shut off the flow of fuel to the engine. Colonel Holger Toftoy was in Europe at the end of World War II and was instrumental in bringing the V-2 material and V-2 scientists to the United States. When he formed the V-2 upper atmosphere panel to review payload proposals, he included both military and civilian scientists. This led to an array of experiments that flew on the V-2s and paved the way for manned space exploration. Many scientific experiments were conducted using the V-2. National Geographic magazine flew a camera on board and took look-down pictures of the Earth. The photos showed the curvature of the Earth, and meteorologists recognized that looking at weather from above the clouds had a great advantage. Other experiments measured cosmic radiation and the effects of weightlessness. The Air Force studied rhesus monkeys during the space flight, and they discovered that during stressful parts of the flight, the animals' heart and respiration rates were within normal range, giving them confidence that humans would someday safely ride in a rocket into space. Now, if I was telling this story in a dissertation or a book, I would have a thesis statement. And my thesis statement would be that if it were not for the V-2 rockets that arrived at White Sands after World War II, the military might just as well have packed up at the end of the war and moved out. But 300 railroad cars full of V-2 parts, as well as many of von Braun's staff and personnel, came to southern New Mexico. With this arrival, the military understood that there was more to this V-2 stuff than just a weapon of war. Somehow they knew that this was very important to the future of the country. And like the ranchers who arrived from Texas in the late 1800s before them, they stayed on. After the arrival of the V-2, the missile range transitioned from a wartime research facility to a military base with larger personnel numbers who focused on research and testing. During the 1950s and 60s, most of the ranchers realized they were not going to get their land back and moved on to other endeavors. Beginning in 1970, ranch unit leases were no longer included public domain lands, leaving only small privately owned parcels. and dramatically reducing annual fees paid to ranchers. In 1974, Congress authorized the purchase of private ranch lands, but provided only enough money for 86% of the land. The government continued to lease the remaining land until more funds were appropriated. In 1980, there were only 34 owners who had not settled with the government. Most sold voluntarily. The Corps of Engineers, under the law of eminent domain, filed in federal court to have the rest of the land condemned for purchase. They then deposited the appraised amounts into the ranchers' bank accounts, and the battle for the ranches at White Sands came to an end. Remember that I said earlier, the reason Trinity Site was important to our story was because of the ranchers who lived there before the war. Well, one of these ranchers was Dave McDonald, who was one of the last to give up. Prior to World War II, David McDonald and his brother Ross owned 640 acres of private land and leased more than 22,000 acres. In 1942, when the government took possession of their land, the brothers received $1,385 per year, plus $1,000 for improvements. In 1948, the payment rose to $7,055. From 1950 to 1970, they received $7,635 per year. And in 1970, the government stopped compensating ranchers for their leased land, and the McDonald's payment dropped to $2,048. When money was made available to purchase all the remaining privately owned land on the range, Dave McDonald refused to sell. In October of 1983, the court rendered a judgment valuing the McDonald land at $160,000 and awarded the deed for the land to the government. In the end, the brothers were paid almost $450,000 for the leases and the final purchase of their 640 acres of private land. Of course, my presentation today covers only part of the story. The actual exhibit tells much more. As part of the exhibit, we constructed a model home based on a tiny Bennett Potter home that still stands at White Sands Missile Range. We also constructed a model of the LC-33, which is the launch complex where the V-2 was tested. You can walk through the building and watch actual footage of the V-2 being launched, both successfully and not so successfully. We included several exemplars in the exhibit. 4 ranch families who represent all those who made their homes at White Sand before World War II, and 4 members of the science and military community who were influential to the growth and development of White Sands Missile Range. We included many artifacts that tell the story as well. A wind generator that once produced power for radios and lights that made ranchers' lives better. A huge bear trap that was used to protect livestock. And 2 kid goat sheds, one which was repurposed by clever ranchers from a military tent cap. On the rocket side of the exhibit, we have pieces of trinitite produced from the explosion of the atomic bomb. We have several items that were brought to the US from Germany with the V-2 rockets, including a rocket engine, film readers, and a cinetheodolite camera. We also included a wall with artifacts and images that tell the story of modern day life at White Sands Missile Range. Definitely worth a trip to the museum. As I mentioned earlier, the exhibit will be on display until June of 2022, and we hope you will come to Las Cruces to see it. So what about the images? The images that you have seen in this presentation are just a few of the hundreds of amazing photographs we used in this exhibit. The ranching images in the presentation are the property of the New Mexico Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum, and the rocket images are used with permission from the New Mexico Museum of Space History. Well, I thank you again for the opportunity to speak today.
Uh, Leah, thank you.
Thank you.
We really appreciate that. Sorry, I had a small technical glitch here, but really, just a really fine presentation. I'm struck by the empathy you have with the farming and ranching community, and the turmoil that grew out of that transfer. At the same time, it opened up new possibilities for the Tularosa Valley. And I understand at one point there were as many as 12,000 people working down there at White Sands. So, but quite transformational with both the pros and cons associated with that. I really was also struck by the photo record that that you have there, and you were able to take advantage of, both for the ranching community and also for what White Sands was contributed to you. Is there more of a story behind how some of these photos came into the possession of the museum?
Well, the ranching photos were all collected, and of course my memory is not going to help me here with the name of the organization, but I can get that to you, as I always say.
That's fine. Yeah.
But it's an archaeological organization here in Las Cruces, and they did oral histories and took a lot of photographs back in the 80s. And so that's where the photos come from the ranching side, and also the quotes that I had. The exhibit has a lot of quotes and information from that collection. So it's pretty amazing. And then of course, I said I worked at the Space Museum earlier, and I was pretty familiar with the pictures that they have. So, and they were very helpful. And also White Sands Missile Range, the museum out there, they were helpful to us with as far as artifacts and getting information. So we had a lot of help. I did want to mention a lot of this exhibit is based on a book called A Pocket Full of Rockets by Jim Eccles, and he was my co-curator on the exhibit. And so I really should have given him much more credit, because without him I couldn't have done this. One of the interesting things that he always says that I think I should have also shared is that the ranchers who lived on the range before the war and the military and scientists who lived there after the war shared some of the same traits. They were self-sufficient, and they had to be motivated and be able to take care of themselves and do a lot of things for themselves because of the place where it is. And so I think that's really kind of a neat connection, even though there was a lot of stress and anxiousness, and the two groups of people were very similar kinds of people. And I think that's an important part of the story as well.
That's wonderful to hear. If you would email me his info, we will append that to
I will.
The chat, and that way those who may be interested in pursuing that could find it. I think it was,
and I'll email you the name of the organization that did all the wonderful work that I used. That of course.
Well, that would be fine too. That's a bonus for us. We do have, for our general audience, wanted to remind you that, feel free to ask questions on the chat. We have a few coming in, and we will be happy to share those with Leah as in the next few moments. To start with, what were the long-term impacts of the White Sands site on the local environment?
Well, interesting. That's an interesting question, because, of course, the White Sands Missile Range is closed to the public generally. You can drive across it on the highway. Twice a year, they do tours out to Trinity site, and you can get tours. And if you go through if you contact the White Sands Missile Range Museum, there are as soon as COVID's over, they do some wonderful tours. You can go see the Bennett Potter House. You can see a lot of this really interesting, these places. So it's closed to the general public mostly. So actually, you'd think, you might think differently, but they've actually, because that land is all closed off, it's kind of been maintained and actually restored to the way it was before the ranching, because ranching is hard on land, and they stripped all the green, all the vegetation, the goats, or and the cattle, and so a lot of it has been restored, and it looks like it did before in some areas. Of course, some places, creosote and isn't, doesn't make it look very, very farm-like or ranch-like. But a lot of livestock, or the wild, not livestock, the wild animals have returned. And of course, in the 60s, I think, or the 70s, they actually stocked White Sands with oryx, which is a kind of wild, I want to say an antelope, I believe. I'm not good with that kind of stuff. So, but a couple of different wild animals from Africa. So those you can hunt those. You can get a license to hunt those out there. So, you wouldn't want to be walking around out there when they're testing bombs, but it is, it's kind of beautiful, especially up in the hills. I was really impressed by when we drove up in the mountains to see some of those ranches and how really pretty the country is. So that's kind of the long-term impact that you'd think it would be more, it would have been more destructive, but it's actually been kind of restorative.
Oh, well, that's a great story. And just further enriches. I was struck as I was, reading up on this in terms of course, you've got the New Mexico Space Museum in Alamogordo. We have the Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum, of course, and you mentioned the museum that's available by appointment there at White Sands. Not to mention the White Sands National Monument itself and the Oregon Mountains. It seems like just a wonderful place to visit and explore, and a great deal of variety.
One thing about the Missile Range Museum, I should probably clarify. I believe that they are closed for about a year because they're in the process. They built a new building, and they're in the process of rebuilding that museum and making it way, way better. So it'll be really wonderful when it opens back up. And you can, when it opens back up, I'm assuming that it will be open to the public, and you have to stop at the gate, and you have to check in and go through all that kind of thing. But it is a great place to come and visit and to take your family, and I've done that many times myself. So there are some really cool things to see down here in southern New Mexico.
One of the things that really came across in your discussion in terms of the farms and ranches is the struggle in order to raise a family, raise a herd and make it make each farm ranch a going concern. But more of an observation than a question, but it really came home to me.
Well, and the truth about it is, it was a tough life. As I said, it was challenging, but it was rewarding. But I did history in the Midwest, and the truth is that people struggled. In the Midwest, it was a lot easier to grow grass, of course, and food for your animals. But the things that the ranchers did to survive were not unique to White Sands so much. They were unique to the lifestyle. Ranching and farming is not easy, no matter where you are, especially during that time period, and especially during the Great Depression. Their lives were very much like a life of a rancher or a farmer, maybe in Kansas somewhere. So the techniques that they used, that's one of the things that I thought was really interesting, was that it was very similar to the same stories that you hear other places. Obviously water was a bigger issue for them, but those kind of people are just tough, and they work hard, and they just, they want to do the best for their families, like we all do.
Yes, indeed. I wanted to mention to folks that if they were interested in learning a bit more, I know that there are video presentations on the web page, both at your normal web page, but also on Facebook with links to the YouTube presentations, which further enrich the discussion that you've had. I was particularly struck by the individual stories you used to tell the story in terms of capturing that. So please go ahead.
We did. We chose 4 different families that lived out at White Sands. The Luceros and the Lucero brothers, if you know anything about the history of Las Cruces, were famous. Las Cruces, they were deputy sheriffs, and they were very good at bringing water. We sort of focused on families that did really well at a particular aspect, like providing food, providing water for their livestock. We talked about the Cox family who actually survived. They actually kept part of their land, and why they were able to do that. And then on the military side, we also chose 4 different individuals. One of them being Werner von Braun, to focus on, that was important to that side. So I think we tried to tell the story as completely as possible.
Yeah, and now that we're beginning to open up, in response after COVID, we're having the exhibit extended into June of 2022 provides an opportunity for those who wish to see that.
And actually, it's July of 2022.
Oh, July. Okay.
So,
July.
so that is actually a little longer, but
wonderful on that. So this will be an opportunity now if you have any last minute comments, and then we'll begin to sign off.
Well, I just thank you so much for the opportunity to speak and to share this story. I think it's a really important story for New Mexico history, and so I just appreciate it. Good.
Well, we very much appreciate you giving us the time and attention. For our audience, of course, this lecture, as well as all of the Friends of History online lectures, are available on Facebook and YouTube and the New Mexico History Museum webpage, along with the Friends of History webpage, where we maintain a catalog of those presentations. So we thank everyone for their participation, especially to Leah, and we will look forward to talking with you all in the future.
Thank you.